My name is Regina Hopkins. I am the Assistant Director of the DC Bar Pro Bono Center, and I'd like to welcome you to our presentation today on board basics. Does your board need an executive committee, and what role should it serve? If you look on your interface for GoToWebinar, you will see that there is a PowerPoint presentation that we're going to be using today. You'll see it as executivecommittee.pdf. Feel free to download that and follow along while we do it. We would like to, I'd like to say thank you and welcome, and we'll get started. There is also a question box. You'll see a question box, and I will open mine. Feel free to type in any questions as we go along, and I will take the time to answer them as we go along. So with that, let's get started. Okay, first let's tell you a little bit about who we are. We're the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. We match nonprofit organizations such as yours with pro bono legal counsel. These attorneys will help you with any legal needs you may have, including corporate governance, IRS compliance, employment law, or real estate matters, similar things. We find pro bono attorneys who will work with you, and we're happy to do so. In addition, we also host brief clinics that address a specific needs such as governance policies, intellectual property, risk management, and you will get notice of those from time to time. And we support trainings, sponsor trainings on important legal topics such as today. And if you go to our website, lawhelp.org/DC/CED, there's a lot of written materials and archived webinars there on our website that you're welcome to go back and listen to. So today's webinar is going to talk about the executive committee. Does your organization need one? That's the first question. And if so, what functions does it serve and should it serve? Who should be on the committee? How often should it meet? And what authority should it have? Those are the basics of the who, what, why, and of executive committees. And we'll go through all of them. The first is, does your organization need an executive committee? A lot of nonprofits have them, and a lot of them don't. I would say it's kind of like 50-50. So if your organization does not have an executive committee, that's not unusual. And there are a lot of mixed feelings about whether there should be an executive committee. When you Google and ask about it, there's a lot of opinions online, and most people will say that yes, an executive committee, a well-run executive committee, can be very useful at times. But a lot of nonprofit governance experts think that they can cause more problems than they solve. And we'll go through some of the issues with executive committees and what you have to be careful as you're going along. And probably the biggest thing that people are concerned about is the executive committee making decisions that really should be made by the board? They're important enough, they're critical enough to the well-being of the organization that the board should be making those decisions, and that sometimes it's just a shortcut or a convenience to have the executive committee make the decisions rather than have the board do so. So what are the traditional reasons for having an executive committee? Well, the typical one is the board may not meet often, and convening a special meeting of the board can take time and be difficult. And so it's just easier to convene an executive committee meeting to deal with certain matters. The other question or the other issue that comes up is that the people on the executive committee are typically people in leadership positions. They may be the officers of the organization or chairs of important committees. And so they're more informed, and they can, to bring them up to speed to make decisions that are need to be made quickly is easier than trying to, in addition to physically convening the board, just getting them familiar with the issues and comfortable in making a decision can be time consuming. So that is basically three, they're just more nimble. The other thing is in your bylaws, for example, typically You may have you have to give notice of a board meeting, and it may be 5 days in advance or 10 days in advance of the meeting, and as compared to an executive committee where often there's only 1 day advance notice or 2 days advance notice required. And if you have an emergency situation, it's just you can meet more quickly, even if everybody were in town, the full board was in town, and you could get them in a room. According to your bylaws, you have to sit and wait out the time before they can meet and make a decision, unless everybody agrees to waive the notice requirement. So it's just the mechanics of calling a board meeting often, in your bylaws, often allow the executive committee to make decisions more quickly. And the other thing is the executive committee can serve as a sounding board for senior management in a way that a larger group of directors cannot. Typically, if a CEO needs help with a particularly thorny personnel issue, or they have some other challenges, they can meet with a small executive committee and go through a lot of those issues more quickly or more easily and more in a more relaxed setting than they could at a full board meeting, particularly if there are other staff members present and you have to kick them out of the room and go to the executive session, the whole thing. So it's just an easier forum for senior management to use to talk about issues that are still in the developmental stages. So what are the concerns? Why are people nervous about executive committees? Well, the first is that they can become cliquish and exclude other directors from the decision making, so that the executive committee sort of tries to retain the decision making authority to themselves, and they just don't involve the full board in the way that they should. They'll say, okay, we'll talk about this and then we'll decide, rather than wait or bring it to the full board for decision. The flip side of that is the board can become disengaged and take a back seat to the executive committee, resulting in a board that's not really meeting its fiduciary duties. They'll, why do I have to go to the meeting? Oh, it's a rainy Friday, or Saturday morning. Let's just have the executive committee do that. And it's just easier to take a back seat and not put forth the full effort that you need to be an effective board member. And then the corollary, or the result of this, is that by establishing the executive committee, the board may fail to address systemic problems. The most obvious one is board attendance. We'll talk a little bit about this later. But if you have a board where it's, the board attendance is not good, sometimes you don't have quorums for your board meetings, things like that. If you have an executive committee, well, that's okay, we don't need a quorum. We'll just have the executive committee do it. And yes, that works in the short term, but you're not really addressing the long-term issue. Now, one of the things that has changed over time is technology. And some of the things that made having board meetings more difficult have been assisted by technology. Given the advent of Skype, WebEx, GoToMeeting, and teleconferencing, it's a lot easier for a board to meet without having to physically convene in a room. And so the result of which is it's just easier. You don't the need to have an executive committee to deal with some of those physical challenges just isn't as important. In addition, there are applications like Google Docs and Dropbox, so you don't have to mail things to people or send a 50-page fax or anything like that the way you used to. You can just put something up in Google Docs or Dropbox, and everybody can have access to it. They just log on. So, one of the factors or the things that you have to think about in terms of whether or not you should have an executive committee, and whether or not, or how often it should meet and what it should do, has to be thought in light of technology. How difficult is it really to convene the board if you had to do it quickly? How difficult is it to get information out if you have all these various technologies there that make it available? Okay, so We're going to take a slight diversion, and we're going to talk about board voting. Because a lot of people, when I say technology, they go, oh, we do this or we do that. We don't have to have meetings. And I'm going to talk a little bit about board voting and just make a few things clear. The first thing you need to know that the board or any board committee that makes decisions on behalf of the organization may only act at a duly called meeting for which proper notice is given and a quorum is present at the time of the vote. So what that means is if you have a board or a committee of the board that has to make a decision, it can only make that decision at a meeting which is properly called and for which a quorum is present. A director can participate via electronic communication, like provided he can hear, speak, and vote. He or she can hear, speak, or vote. So it's okay to have a conference call. It's okay to have people call in. That's all okay. You just can't have, what you cannot do is have them vote by ballot or proxy. I can't send an alternate to my board meeting. I can't vote in advance of the meeting. I can't send an email to the chair saying, I'm in favor of the budget. So you can tell them that I voted yes. And you can't vote by ballot, meaning you can't send out an email to people and say, let us know by Friday at 5 o'clock if you're in favor of this or not. And at 5 o'clock, on an 11-person board, 7 people voted yes, great, the budget has passed, right? Wrong, because that is not a valid vote. And the only exception to these rules is what is known as a unanimous written consent. And what you can do is you can send an email to people that says, we're asking you to approve the budget by unanimous written consent, explain exactly what's the action to be taken, and then all directors then serving on the board, i.e. on an 11-person board, all 11 members have to agree in writing to the action. So if I have an 11-member board and 10 people say yes and one person doesn't respond, then you don't have a unanimous written consent and you have to wait for a board meeting. And that is the rules. That's the rules in every state, and that's been the rules since basically it's basic corporate law. And the idea is the reason is that you want the board to get together, talk to each other, listen to each other, understand exactly what people's different perspectives are, why they think X or Y. Maybe they'll change. Maybe you'll change your mind. Maybe you'll have a compromise. But you can't do it unless you're in the room together, talking, or on a conference call together, talking. And so that's why there is a requirement that you have to make decisions in properly called board meetings. And the only exception are for decisions that are so non-controversial that everybody agrees with them in advance. So, a lot of people have gotten to the habit of voting by email. And if you say, this is unanimous consent, we're asking you to approve this by unanimous consent, and everybody, in fact, agrees, that's fine. But except for that, it's not valid. So I have a couple of questions, so I'll take a time to answer them. Someone asked, what do you do with people who are outside the United States? And how do you deal with the technology? That is the issue. That's one of the good things about Skype and some of the internet is that it makes it easier for people who are outside of the United States to participate in a board meeting because they can log in through the internet, and you can have a Skype application. It's not perfect, but it is possible, and that's something you have to think about. I just remember, as I was preparing for this meeting, I remembered that when I was first practicing law, we had a nonprofit. I worked for a nonprofit, and we had people in Africa, and they used to only have trunk lines, physical lines that ran along the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean to Africa for phones, and there were only a few of them, and so it was oftentimes difficult during the course of the day to get through to Africa. So people on our staff would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to send a fax. Yeah, those days are past. We have fiber optics, we have the internet, we have satellite technology. So it's not without some challenges, but so that's the thing. You just have to make as much use of technology as you can in those circumstances. And as I said, if someone is present through electronic communications where they can be heard, speak, and vote, then they're as present as anybody else. Okay. So when should you have an executive committee? When is it advisable? Well, a lot of organizations have a large board, and getting a quorum is easier with an executive committee. There are some organizations that may have 50, 75, I've seen 100-member boards. And for them to get a quorum present for their meeting was often a challenge. So they use the executive committee. Now, I will say this is a case where maybe the systemic solution has to be considered as well. The answer may be that you use the executive committee in the short term, but you'd reduce the size of the board. If you're having difficulty getting a quorum because you have too many, your board is so large, it's just hard to get that many people in a room, then the answer is not relying on the executive committee. The answer is reducing the size of the board so it's more manageable. You'll have to do it over time, but that's really the long-term solution, because what you're effectively doing is you're making the executive committee the board, and so you have all these people with the title of director who have the legal liability, but they're not actually exercising the authority. And that puts them in a difficult situation. So that's why it's better to fix the systemic problem, even if you're using the executive committee in the short term to deal with immediate needs. The other situation may be the board only meets a few times a year, and the board needs to rely on the executive committee to review material and make decisions more frequently. This often happens, in getting back to the case of the board with people overseas. I worked for a nonprofit. I had board members outside the U.S. And so for, just logistically, it was difficult to meet frequently. They only met 3 times a year. And to supplement that, we had an executive committee meeting to take up what would have otherwise been a 4th board meeting. So those are situations where it may make sense. It also is more effective and it reduces costs, particularly when you have people traveling. And then here's another, and probably the most interesting thing, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. Use the executive committee to handle routine matters, and that frees up time for the board to handle more important issues. So everything doesn't have to come to the board level. It can be either decided at the finance committee or the executive committee. And, so your meetings are more efficient in terms of using your time in a way that's most productive, rather than spending the time on fairly routine matters that aren't that can be handled in a different way. Okay. And someone said, is it wise to have finance and fundraising committee as part of the executive committee? Well, they could be freestanding committees and have decision-making authority as well. For example, if you have a budget variance, you could have the finance committee make that decision. We'll talk about the composition of the executive committee and who should be on it, and maybe those people, maybe the chairs of those committees should be on your executive committee to get that input. But the executive committee is an important committee because it generally has the broadest authority, but it's not the only committee to whom decision-making authority can be delegated. So what are the duties of an executive committee? Well, under DC law, the executive committee can be authorized to take any steps the board of directors can take, with 4 exceptions. The first is they can't authorize the distribution of the organization's assets. And by that, I'm not saying they can't authorize spending of money. I'm saying they can't authorize, like, we're going to spin off this program, or we're going to transfer this program to another nonprofit, those types of big ticket items. They can't adopt, amend, or repeal the bylaws. That's something only the board can do. They can't fill vacancies on the board of directors or any board committees. Again, that's something that only the board of directors can do. And in the case of a membership organization, they can't propose that any action be put to the members for a vote. Again, those are considered substantial enough and important enough decisions that only board members can make those decisions. So typically, in the typical, you'll see the bylaws give the executive committee this very broad authority to make decisions that the board can make, subject to those exceptions that we talked about under DC law. But not always. There are other exceptions that you'll see. One of them is, for example, the bylaws can provide that the executive committee doesn't have the authority to hire and fire the CEO. You know, there's a lot of compelling arguments to make that it is too important a decision to be made by anything less than the full board. The only caveat to that is if you have a bad actor as your CEO and you want to get rid of them quickly, it will slow you down a little bit. You know, but that's basically, you know, that's a common exception that only the full board can hire and fire the CEO. You may also want to make clear that the committee doesn't have authority to overturn a board decision unless the facts change. So, you know, you approve a major new program at the board level, the board has thrashed it out back and forth, yes, no, okay, yes. And you don't want the executive committee to come the week afterwards and say, we're reversing that decision. Because the executive committee happens to be made up of the people who didn't like it, didn't agree with it. You'd say that they can only overturn a decision if the facts change. For example, the approval of the new program was contingent on certain funding coming through. The funding didn't come through, and then the executive committee may come in and stop it or suspend it or something like that, because the facts on which the board based its decision just didn't pan out, and then it makes sense at that point to revisit the decision. And sometimes the bylaws require that the board ratify any decisions by the executive committee. The only problem with that is basically you haven't, the executive committee really can't make any decisions then. They can't act on behalf of the board because every decision has to be ratified, and the net effect of that is no decision is final until the board has met and the you know, and the board has met and they've approved the decision. So let me check to see if there's any more questions. I don't think so. Okay. So who can serve on the executive committee? Under DC law, and in probably the law in all states, actually, if the board, oh wait, I went too far, sorry. Only DC law, only directors may serve on the executive committee. That is because any committee to whom the board delegates its decision-making authority, whether it's the finance committee, the audit committee, whatever, can only be made up of directors. And it's explicit under DC law, and it is, you know, but if you talk to governance experts, they'll actually say that's the law in every state. That's just part of the common law that if you can have non-board members serve on advisory committees, but any committee that has the right to make final decisions without additional board approval or review must be composed only of directors. The CEO cannot be a member of the executive committee unless he or she is also a director. So it's very common to have the CEO as part of an executive committee, and they cannot be, they can attend the meetings, but they cannot vote on matters if they're not also a director of the board. Some executive committees are very small and they'll consist only of the officers. And others can be quite large. My organization I worked with, over half, the executive committee was slightly more than half the board. Which approach you take will depend on what you're using the executive committee for. There are times where I think it makes a lot more sense to have a bigger committee, and then there are times when a small committee would be fine. So if your primary purpose in setting up an executive committee is for it to serve as a sounding board for the CEO, you may want to limit it just to board officers. And in fact, you could just have a meeting of the officers. You don't even have to have a formal executive committee. You could have a sort of kitchen cabinet, if you will, the board. And because, you know, there's nothing, you're not asking it to take formal action very often. You know, it's mostly just a pre-vetting of ideas and concepts before it goes to the full board. So things are, you know, the bad, really clunker ideas get weeded out before they take up much of the board's time. And in that context, you know, a smaller or group of people may be more advisable. But if your board meets less frequently and you use the executive committee to make significant decisions on behalf of the organization, then you probably want a larger committee to ensure that more perspectives are being considered and to avoid the feeling that the committee is cliquish or secretive. And typically what you would do in those cases is, in addition to the officers, you'd have chairs of standing committees like the audit committee or the fundraising committee, or any sort of standing board committees would be there. You'll also sometimes see one or two at-large members, just if you have a more experienced board member, but they happen to not be on a committee, or they represent a particular constituency that's important to hear from. Like if you're a parent or an educational organization, they represent a parent or something like that. Then you can have them in those type of situations. And like I said, my organization, because they had people from all over, they only met 3 times a year, and they supplemented that with a 4th executive committee meeting. And because it was such a large meeting, you actually got most of the viewpoints heard that you needed to hear from. Now, the question is, and someone raised this question, he said, well, over half the board is here at our executive committee meeting. Isn't that just a board meeting? And the answer is no, because in order to be an effective board meeting, you have to invite all directors to come. You just have to be content with it being an executive committee meeting, because even though more than half are present, not everybody was given the right to come, and so therefore you don't meet the requirements for a board meeting. Okay. So what should the committee decide at its meetings? And I'm going to go through 3 scenarios of situations where, you know, it's sort of the good, bad, and the ugly. So the DC Code, like we said, gives the board, the executive committee, pretty broad range powers. So if your bylaws give them that broad range powers, if your bylaws provide it, then they can pretty much make most decisions. The question is, should it? Just because you have the right to exercise that authority, is it really a good thing to do? You know, and you know, you have to ensure that the directors, all directors, are meeting their fiduciary duties, and that the board is governing the organization at its heart rather than a subset of the board. So that's why it's important that, like I said, if you have systemic problems, that you deal with them, like board attendance, you know, either get people off the board or think about how you reschedule your meetings or whatever. You have to deal with the attendance issue. You know, figure out what board members are you taking. Are you just getting people who are overcommitted? They look great. Oh man, they're on every board in the city. They'd be a great board member. Well, maybe not. Maybe they're already got a full schedule and they're just not going to have the time that you need to do that. So you have to think about those issues and deal with those. And you know, and you shouldn't use the committee as a way to avoid the responsibility, the tough decisions that are going to have to be made. So let's deal with our 3 scenarios. So the first scenario is the one we just talked about. Board attendance is a problem, and it's difficult to get a quorum, and that really slows up the work of the organization. You have a monthly board meeting, and you're about to approve something, and you can't approve it because, man, you know, not enough people showed up. And so you say, well, we'll just have the executive committee make the decision. That helps you in the short run. You got to address the attendance problem. Directors who do not show up are not fulfilling their fiduciary duties. And therefore, they can be held liable if something goes wrong. And more to the point, if you're a director and you do show up, but you don't address this issue, you can be held liable because the board is failing in its fiduciary oversight as well as a fiduciary oversight. It is getting an F because it can't even get a quorum present. And so there's liability that attaches to that, and so you have potential liability that attaches to that, and so you have to, in order to avoid that potential liability, you have to fix the problem, and relying on an executive committee is not fixing the problem. Okay, so that's scenario one. Scenario two, the board is not focusing on big issues. So you have organization B, they spend their the board spends its meetings dealing with routine matters such as small budget variances, and the board engages in micromanaging. There is not enough time at board meetings to discuss issues like the strategic plan. You know, you have a 2.5-hour meeting, you're starting at 7, you're finishing at 9:30. And finally you go over the new copier. You finally vote to buy the new copier at 9:10. Okay, we're going to have 20 quality minutes on whether our mission is serving our needs, our clients. And so that's the problem that you get into. And so if you delegate those types of decisions to management where appropriate, or a finance committee, or an executive committee, essentially you free up the board's time to deal with the big issues, the issues that only the board can handle because they're so important. And sometimes the way you do it is you just say, the board's not going to consider budget variances unless they hit a certain dollar level, whether it's depending on your organization. Let's say you have $1 million budget. Unless it's $50,000, it's going to be held by the executive committee or the finance committee or something like that. And just, or $25,000, whatever you feel is significant. But just so you're not eating up time on stuff that's not as critical as the fact that maybe your fundraising has gone down for the last 3 years, and you got to figure out how to reverse that trend. So, and once the board makes its decision, the committee makes a decision, the board doesn't rehash it. They don't revisit and rediscuss and relitigate the issue. The committee's made a decision, it's a perfectly reasonable decision. The discussion, it's done. And the board, when you get on the agenda, maybe you have 15 minutes or 20 minutes on routine stuff, and then you have 2 hours on what are we going to do about fundraising. So, and this is true whether you have less frequent meetings or more frequent meetings, you can still end up churning a lot of time on things that aren't as important, and having an executive committee handle those everyday routine matters really frees up the board's time to focus in on the important stuff. Okay. And then dealing with scenario 3, confidential matters. Okay, so organization C uses the executive committee to deal with evaluating and compensating the CEO and conducting investigations, so the matters are handled confidentially. And that's just a reality. That's a perfectly good use for an executive committee or some other committee, is to deal with things that you want to keep close at hand. In which you occasionally report to the board, but the board is not meeting and discussing it in total. Obviously, the more people who are involved in a discussion or a decision, the more likely the matter is not going to be kept confidential. So by keeping the matters confidential and closer in hand, then you keep it confidential, particularly with investigations. And then the executive committee may report to the full board, what's going on, but, the actual discussions are held in a smaller forum. A couple of things. One, people are more willing to be candid. The larger the group of people, the more people that are in the room that you may know, some you know better than others, the less likely you are to speak candidly. And so some of these matters like evaluations and investigations and things like that, you have to have complete candor with people. And a smaller forum may allow you to get more candor. It certainly doesn't mean that, for example, if you're evaluating the CEO, that you're not going to reach out to the board. You may send them an email asking them to email you their reflections, or you can break up, the various board members, committee members can call the other board members and ask for their one-on-one opinions. And, in order to ensure that people are fully honest. And then the committee can report on the aggregate findings, like, we talked to everybody and, a lot of people felt that the CEO should be more responsive, for example. People may say that in one-on-one conversations, but they're not going to say it in a big board meeting, even if it's an executive session. So that's another way that you can use the executive committee as a way of dealing with some of these more delicate personnel matters and other things. Okay, and then finally, record keeping. The IRS believes, and the DC Code agrees with them, that you should have the same discipline about recording your committee, the minutes of your committee meetings as you are with board meetings. And in fact, the Form 990 asks that board committees keep contemporaneous minutes of their meetings, meaning that they're prepared within 60 days or by the time the next executive committee meeting, whichever occurs later. So if you have an executive committee that meets, once every other month or once a quarter, then you should have the minutes prepared at that meeting. If they meet once a month, then you have 60 days to prepare the minutes. But basically, you should be preparing minutes in the same way you prepare board meeting minutes. And this is true even if you have a meeting and you don't make a decision. You're not voting on anything. It's the same with board meetings. The fact that you could vote, you have the authority to vote, is what triggers the meeting minutes requirement. What you don't do is often as important to record as what you do. So you should, if you have an executive committee meeting we should have minutes the same way, and you can circulate them amongst the full board once they're final. And that way you can carry the board, because the board always has, even though they can delegate authority to a committee, the board still has the responsibility to making sure that that committee is carrying out its fiduciary duties appropriately. That it is the board, like if you have a finance committee, that the finance committee is meeting often enough, or an audit committee that they're involved enough in the audit, or you have a fundraising committee that's active and engaged, or that you have an executive committee that's carrying out its duties. And if any of those committees are failing in their responsibilities, the board has a responsibility to address it by either changing the membership of the committee or changing its responsibilities or taking away its authority or something. You can't let a committee go on acting in an inappropriate manner. You have to, the board has a fiduciary responsibility to step in. And the way you do that is you get regular reports on the actions of the committee to the full board. And that can be done through minutes. It can be done through a report at the board meeting. There are a number of ways to do it, but it is important that that feedback loop happens so that the board can evaluate the work of the committee and decide whether, and like I said, not to revisit it, not to rehash it, but to make sure, are they following good processes? Yes. Are they meeting often enough to carry out their duties? Yes. Do they seem to be asking the right questions and getting the information they need to make good decisions? Yes. Does their decisions seem to be based on the facts and appropriate things? Yes. if you get those if that's the feedback that you get when you hear their reports or get their written minutes, then you can be confident that the committee is operating properly without revisiting all their decisions. So I have another question. Are all board committees required to keep contemporaneous minutes or just the executive committee? Every committee that has the authority to make final decisions, what the statute calls board committees, the statute being the nonprofit code, every one of them must keep minutes. And the IRS also, in their question of whether your committees are keeping minutes, that's what they're focusing in on. Again, not whether they do, but whether they have the authority to make those final decisions. You have to look at your charter or your bylaws, your committee charter or your bylaws, to see whether they have that power. Advisory committees, by that I mean committees that are only authorized to give advice and not make any final decisions. They can't approve spending or anything like that. All they do is make recommendations to the board. They don't have to keep minutes because they're not making decisions that have to be memorialized, or they're not having those type of discussions that need to be memorialized. They're just expressing an opinion. So, so the answer to that is, if they're making decisions on behalf of the organization, then they have to keep minutes. Now, I will say, generally speaking, most people's minutes are too long. You only have to say they met, this is what they discussed, i.e. whether to buy a new computer system for $5,000. The committee reviewed the estimates and determined that they were going to go with the XYZ vendor because they offered the best quality for the price. And then the board voted in favor. And that's it. You don't really need to have anything more than that. You just have to sort of say, who is there? What did they do? And a sentence or two about why. Nothing more than that. And you don't have to capture the discussions. Most people go back, they write down, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said that, so-and-so said this. That, it doesn't have to be in the minutes. It's not legally necessary, and it can only get you in trouble. Because what it does is it shows where the conflict is in the board. So if you're ever in litigation, like someone's suing you, a former employee suing you, or something like that, you pull out the minutes, and if all the meeting, if it's showing all that back and forth between the members, they know who to talk to and who's mad at who and who's likely to sort of blame somebody else and say something inappropriate or whatever. So you don't want to give people a roadmap. So yes, minutes, but brief. That's the key. Just all you have to do. So, and so with that, any other questions? I'm happy to do that. Like I said, I think a lot of people have executive committee, but a lot of them don't. So if you don't have one, maybe it will be helpful, but it's not necessary, and a lot of organizations don't have executive committees. So if you have any additional questions about this going forward, or as you're trying to implement, maybe I persuaded you, oh, we need an executive committee, and you don't know what to do or how to get it going, just give us a call. And like I said, the way most bylaws work now is it just allows you to create committees. But with an executive committee, you probably want a specific provision in your bylaws creating the executive committee rather than have it done just through board resolutions. So we're happy to help. We will be sending you out a survey later on today. You can get an electronic, when you complete the survey, there's an additional PowerPoint copy of the PowerPoint if you haven't downloaded it now. And anyway, thank you for your time, and have a great afternoon.